All right, so welcome. Good evening. Glad to have you back for Class 3 of People's Planning Academy 2.0. Tonight we're going to cover walkability, walkable neighborhoods. And so we're going to start off with an activity, kind of cold open. That will take probably 20 or 30 minutes or so. And then we'll turn it over to Kim Irwin, who's with Health by Design, to go kind of in depth about walkability in neighborhoods. And then we should have plenty of time for conversation and questions. Does that sound fair? All right, so in front of you, you have a game board, and there should be a baggie full of stuff on it. Go ahead and open that baggie up. All right, so inside of your baggie, you have a series of tiles. On the screen, you can see there are different types of tiles, and they all have different names. We'll turn the lights on when I'm done here in a second so you can read them. But there are tiles that kind of a reddish background. Those are commercial uses, things like offices and factories and restaurants and bars. You have residential uses, so those are in yellow. So you have single-family homes, townhomes, and apartments. And then you have things with green in the background. Those are public uses, so things like hospitals and schools and libraries and police stations. You also should have a pink ribbon. That is a bus line. And so if you remember from Class 1, way back when we talked about thoroughfare planning, what were the busy roads called? Arterials. Fantastic. And so go ahead and place, on your board you have two arterial roads. One goes north and one goes south. Ignore the county line road on the edge. But go ahead and place your bus route down one of the lines. So that pink ribbon, go ahead and place it down one of your arterial roads. And then I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to lay out your ideal community. And so each one of those tiles goes on one piece of property, so one square or rectangle of land. And go ahead and lay them out. We'll give you about 10 minutes. There's no right or wrong way. So it looks like most people are wrapping up. If you're not, you can go ahead and continue working. But for those of you who are done, do you have want to talk about your philosophy or any strategy you had about laying things out? Just yell it out.
Colors.
Colors. What do you mean colors?
Yeah, we first kind of grouped them by colors.
So you group things by colors? Okay.
Factories away from families.
So factories away from families. All right. Linda?
We stuck as much along the bus line as we could possibly squeeze.
All right. So you squeeze as much on the bus line. Any other strategies? Judith?
We put the substance abuse clinic and the homeless shelter away from the neighborhoods.
All right, so those NIMBY uses that we have to have but no one wants in their backyard, you put far away from the neighborhoods. All right.
Or we can put them right on the main drag.
Or put them on the main drag.
Yeah.
All right, did anyone so this layout obviously represents different types of street patterns, so we all have all of them in Marion County. Did any of you put the factory in the subdivision? Did anyone? No. Why? Why not?
You move there so you get away from all that stuff.
You move there to get away from it. What did we learn in our first class? We had different maps of Denver. What we learned was Denver. And we learned about the association of land use and transportation patterns, right? And so the subdivision really isn't conducive to driving trucks, right? And so that is why you didn't place the factory there, right?
I'm more concerned about the people. That makes sense too.
That makes sense too.
So the big look, you need to make sure in the subdivision you have smaller streets so they won't look factory.
Right, and there's an association, right. So, all right, so for the next exercise, you have, some of you asked for the different color strings, and we're going to use that next. And so the different color strings represent different types of people living in a family. And so on your board, you also have a blue house. Everyone find your blue house. So there's a house that's on blue paper. That's where your family lives, and this is the multi-generational household. And so you have people at different stages in their life. And so the first person living here is you're going to think about mom or dad, and they can drive. They have a car, and so they're represented by the really long brown string. And so your job is to use the roads. They have to drive on roads, but they're going to drive. Use that string to lay out along the road and connect the blue house with a factory. And so hold on. So that's one person you're going to connect. The second person is a 13 or 14-year-old boy or girl. they have to walk to, they're walking to school, and so obviously they can't walk as far. And so find your school, one of your schools, and see if you can connect them with the blue line. Now, the thing about the blue line is they can only walk where there's sidewalks and there's crosswalks. And so you'll see the dark gray part of your board, and that's the road, and then some of those have a light gray next to it. That's a sidewalk. And so if there's no sidewalk there, they can't walk on that road. And then finally, we have grandma. Grandma is represented by the two pink lines. And that is grandma walking to the bus, and then riding the bus, and then getting off the bus and walking to the library. And so she can only walk a little bit. So she can walk one string to the bus line, one string from the bus line to the library. So go ahead and see if you can make that work. Was anyone not able to get mom or dad to the factory? All right. How about a little boy or girl going to school, walking to school? Who was not able to get them to school? They jaywalked. All right, so why weren't you able to get them to school? So it's a necessity, but why weren't they able to get to school? Was it because it was too far away, or because you didn't have sidewalks, or both? Yeah, and so both of those things happen. And so it's not just about the facility, right? You can have sidewalks, but if things are too far apart, then it doesn't work for that mode of transportation. So you have to think about both how you get around as well as proximity. How about grandma and using the bus? Who was not able to get her to the library? All right, so why was that?
We did not notice there wasn't a sidewalk outside the library, and it was a little bit too far for her to walk.
All right, a little too far to walk and no sidewalks. So about who else why you were not able to get to the library? Too far of a walk. All right. So we're going to pretend it's the early 1970s, and I've got two NDOT commissioners here. And we are going to randomly place an interstate highway through this community. And you do not get to choose where it goes. We do. You can't move it. And so the rules are the arterial roads still go through. And so the county line road still goes through. There's a bridge under the interstate for those. And your two main lines still go through, your two main arterials. All of your local streets, the smaller streets, are cut off. And so you can no longer use them to get around. And so after we place the interstate in your community, we're going to ask you to repeat this exercise and try to get mom or dad to the factory, little boy or girl to school, and then grandma to the library. If you remember from our last class, this actually happens. It happened a lot in our city in the early 70s. And so how many of you lost your house? Yep. Yeah, so your grandma did? Okay. Yeah, so if you remember from last time, 18,000 people were dislocated by the construction of our interstates, disproportionately in neighborhoods of color. So that happened here in our city, and so this is a real-life exercise. Now, for those of you, how many of you were still able, for those of you who still had a house, how many were able to get dad or mom or dad to the factory still driving? Was anyone not able to get them driving to work? Yeah, and so the interstates might have made it more inconvenient because you can't drive on some of the side roads, but you can still get around, right? What about for your little boy walking to school? How many of you were no longer able to get him to school? Anyone? Yeah, and so what happened?
Well, you destroyed our school, so that...
Right, so in their case, the interstate destroyed the school, and so all the kids had to go farther away to the different school, right? All right. And then how about grandma trying to get to the library? Was she still able to get there? No? Who was not able to get grandma to the library? Right, you guys, again. So no sidewalks. All right. Well, so that happened, right? We went through a phase in our city where we destroyed lots of our urban fabric. We disrupted lots of urban streets across our city. Now it's 2017, and voters have approved an increase in rapid transit. And so we're going to distribute another bus line and have you put that on your other arterial and see if that changes the game for grandma at all. so for how many of you that were not able to get grandma to the library the first time were able to get her there now? So one table. How many of you still could not help her?
Do we have a gate in our fence or no?
There's no gates and fences in this community. All right. So those of you who were able to get her there before the interstate and before the bus probably made a good sighting location in that you located your house around the bus line, right? For a lot of you, the second bus line probably didn't have that much of an impact. And that's because it was an afterthought. You didn't organize your community around it. And so if when we talk about transit-oriented development next time, we'll kind of make the phrase that every type of development is oriented around some type of transportation. Development is oriented around transportation. It's not transportation is oriented around development. And so the fact that you were able to make transit-oriented development happen when you knew the bus line was there, but not when it was an afterthought, is kind of explaining that. It's kind of testifying to that. Any other observations from this exercise about moving people around different ways, different modes, how the city's laid out, different street patterns? Yeah.
It's like real life, because there's some places that when you built the roads, you put sidewalks. Some places you built the roads, you don't have the sidewalks.
Right. Yep. Some of you, who put their blue house in the middle of the subdivision? Did anyone do that? Yeah, so, and that's, you had the hardest time. And so the suburban type of street pattern like that, that's very disconnected, it's very hard to make connections because there's not a lot of intersections to cross at, right? So that's one challenge we face is connectivity in some of our suburban areas is not fantastic. All right, any final comments anyone wants to make?
Waterways are not much of a feature in the decision making.
Waterways were not much of a feature. How many of you built on your waterways? Yeah, okay. How many of you built something besides parks and gardens? Right? That's what we do in America. We build in our floodplains. Yeah. All right, there's no floodplains in this river never floods. All right, any other observations or anything? All right, so go ahead and just leave this. We reuse these, so please don't take the pieces, but you can leave them alone on your table. And we'll move on to the next part of our evening to talk about walkability and walkable neighborhoods. And for that, I'd like to introduce Kim Irwin, who's the Executive Director of Health by Design.
Thank you, Brad. Hi, everyone. Good to be with you this evening. See many familiar faces and some new ones as well. My name is Kim Irwin. I'm the Executive Director of Health by Design, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about what we do, but walkability is a big part of it, so it's good to be a walker. So Health by Design is a nonprofit organization. We work at the intersection of the built environment and public health, and I'll say more about that. But essentially, we're trying to ensure that our public spaces, our neighborhoods, and our transportation infrastructure promote healthy, active living. Our work is cross-disciplinary and crosses multiple sectors, which is an extremely important piece of that. We do a lot of work specifically here in Indianapolis. Again, I'll speak more to that, but we do also do work around the entire state. And we're a coalition model, which means, again, we're bringing people together from different sectors with different interests. But that means that a lot of our work is around convening partners, facilitating dialogue, providing education, training, and technical assistance. And then policy and advocacy is a big piece of that work as well, in addition to the promoting smart design feature, right? Exactly what we've been doing. We want to make sure that collectively our communities and the state are making the wisest decisions they can in that way. So just to touch quickly the graphic on the left, that's again referencing the intersection of the built environment and public health. We talk about 4 direct health impacts: opportunities for physical activity that come with trails and sidewalks, bikeways, that kind of thing. The safety element, which is significant and really critical for what we call vulnerable roadway users, people who are not protected by tons of steel as they move about our community. Air quality and those environmental aspects that are so important. Again, even though we don't necessarily talk about them, climate change is real and the transportation sector contributes, bottom line. And then we also talk about access as a direct public health impact. And so that can mean everything from access to medical care, to the role of emergency response and homeland security, to, can you get to a job? Can you get to the library? Can you get to your educational opportunities? So all of that is extremely important in terms of, all of that is influenced extremely by how we build our communities. The right image is showing the elements of a healthy community. And again, I'll talk more about that a bit, but in public health, we call those social determinants of health, which is not a very public friendly word or phrase for saying that. But what it essentially means is that our transportation systems, our housing, the crime and violence in our community, our access to educational opportunities, the jobs we can have in our community, that all of those things are critically important to how long we live and how well we live. We say, and you may have heard it said increasingly, that our zip code is much more important than our genetic code in terms of our health. And yet, for decades and decades, we have sort of shifted societally, specifically here in the US in many ways, around thinking of health as a doctor's office, right? It's treatment for disease that exists already by and large. We spend the vast majority, 90+% of all healthcare dollars on treatment, and very, very little on the prevention as it relates to housing and jobs and transportation and education, which is what we know creates, again, healthy living for as long as possible. So when we talk about that healthy communities piece and the streets and public spaces, we really want to ensure that those are for everyone, whether you're walking, whether you're riding, whether you're using transit, if you're using a mobility device. That public space, which is paid for with public dollars, rightfully belongs to all of us. Again, we've built our communities for decades in ways, though, that shut people out if they're not in a car, which has been prioritized. And so we're really working to ensure that all of those public settings are providing safe, accessible, convenient, connected opportunities for moving around and living the life you want to live. I want to just take a moment here to say that when I'm talking about walking, I am also being inclusive of people using mobility devices, whether that's a walker or a cane or a wheelchair, power chair. We say sometimes walk and roll, and that I'll probably just say walking, but please know that we are absolutely talking about accessibility for all. When we design our places for people with disabilities, we are designing it for everyone. Universal design ultimately, again, serves us all. I want to take one other moment to touch on the healthy living, physical activity piece of it. A lot of the funding that we've had over the years comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. These are public health dollars going into, again, this type of work. But they are recently using and promoting, and we are part of that with this Active People Healthy Indy brand, what we call activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. And again, it's a mouthful, but if you take a minute to reflect on that, again, it's very much about thinking about the places we go every day, we need to go, exactly the places that are on your board, and ensuring that the options for getting there are not those that prohibit movement, right? Movement is good for our bodies, independent of any other factor. It's not about weight, it's not about chronic disease management only, it's not about mental health, but it's about all of those things. Movement is good for our bodies, and when we can build that into our daily routine, whether it's with our children walking to school or biking from one meeting to the next during the workday, using transit and having that first mile, last mile connections as we talk about them. I think you've already covered that part. Having those be movement-based physical activity. It's good for us in so many ways, and it's good for our communities. Also want to emphasize health equity for a moment. This is a really critical piece of the work, and again, maybe it doesn't always get said as overtly as it probably should, but we know that some people, some communities, some neighborhoods are disproportionately impacted by lack of transportation options, by unsafe streets, by the way interstates have cut through, and that kind of thing. And so where our work has evolved, and we, Health by Design completed a new strategic plan in the spring of 2018, and we were very intentional in that and in trying to move forward, and as are many other groups, is to, again, be very straightforward and transparent about the fact that health equity must be addressed, must be sort of directed head on, and that's about having fair and just opportunities for everyone to be healthier. And that in doing that, we have to be talking about racism. We have to be talking about other forms of oppression. We have to be talking about power dynamics and the way that, again, things like poverty, discrimination, the consequences of that ultimately impact those social determinants of health and further contribute to disproportionality in diseases, disparities in length of life, and that kind of thing. Have any of you seen this image before? There's 3 people standing, trying to watch a baseball game over a fence. In the first image, just a quick show of hands. Has anybody seen this? Okay, good. Okay, a number of you. So, and this is important for us in sort of talking about the difference between equality and equity. We've sort of arguably evolved to think that, well, if we just start giving everyone the same thing, we bring up the bottom, we'll take care of the problems we have. Give everyone one box, they can stand on it, but that still doesn't help solve the problem of being able to see the game. If we approach it from an equity factor and a fairness factor and what is needed, again, given reality of height or the history of investment, we know that some people are going to need different supports in order to achieve the same outcome, seeing the baseball game in this image. So that means that, again, when we're looking at different neighborhoods, when we're looking at different communities in this context, we really have to be thinking about, again, history, sort of the reality of where we're at, and then what is needed to ensure that. So again, I think we've all sort of seen an evolution in this conversation. I think by and large it's positive. We have a long way to go, but we're getting there. What I want to introduce that you may not have seen is this third panel to the image, which is where there's a chain link fence. And what this says is that in the third image, all 3 can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed. The systemic barrier has been removed, right? So it does it change your perspective a little bit in thinking about it, right? And so we talk in our work increasingly and a lot, and it doesn't always resonate sort of in the ways we're saying about like upstream factors or, again, systemic factors, the policies that drive that. And so we can, I guess my point in saying that is, again, when we think sort of true primary prevention from a health standpoint, when we think upstream, when we think about what it takes for all people to sort of be able to benefit in the same way, it is not just about building sidewalks in places where there are none, but it's about understanding why sidewalks have been built in some places and why they haven't, and how we address that systematically from a policy and procedure standpoint to ensure that it changes. And then I'd just like to offer this. It's an image from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a big public health funder and working on a lot of these issues. But it's a perfect analogy with bikes, which we love, of why if we give 4 different people with different ages and heights and needs the same bike, they can't all ride. But if we make that point to connect people with what they need, in this case a bike that's adapted for them, they can all enjoy the ride. Pause there just for a minute. Any comments or questions sort of on what I've said? Yeah.
Brad, I know you talked about the prevailing winds on bring all the toxins to the east.
Mm-hmm.
So are cities thinking now about building all their factories on the east side of town? I mean, just something that simple to how she removed the barrier with the chain-link fence instead of the other kind of thing. So I mean, is that even a thought that cities are thinking about?
Well, I think people, the point I was making is wealth rarely ended up in American cities on the east side of town because the factories blew their pollution over there, right? It's not that we actually strategically located factories to make that happen. And in the case of factories, a lot of the Clean Air Act has cleaned up a lot of the problem that we had. And so, we had government regulation to help solve that. And there's also the reality that most modern day industry is not that dirty. More of our problem today is the legacy pollutants that are left behind in our neighborhoods, but also the pollution caused by our highways and our roadways. And so if you look at the pollutants in Indianapolis, they're often associated with where our interstates are, with where our truck traffic is.
I have a question. So this is coming more so, again, from Healthy by Design.
Uh-huh.
But how are we making sure the quality, equity, and justice is being implemented further into the public decision process and the
Yeah.
budget making
Yeah.
for what our consolidated streams are?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, what's
Sure.
currently going on with that?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to talk in more specifics about some of the work we're doing, which I think will address it. But I think that the question is exactly the question that we need to be asking, and that collectively we need to be having discussions about. Is how do we, how are we ensuring that equity and justice and I can't remember. The quality, equity, justice is being incorporated into decision-making processes, into policies, into plans that impact what happens. And that, I don't think I started by saying this, so I'll say it now. I commend you all for being here, because this right here, this type of activity is critical to ensuring that long term, right? It's hard to take the time to do this. You all have other commitments that could be, taking up your time right now. But this level of engagement and participatory, engagement in our communities at the neighborhood level, at the city, to even to understand how these decisions these decisions get made, but then to know how to take action and to bring people along with you is key. So we are working on that in our way, which I am going to talk about, but I think that that's part of, I hope what this is all about is helping learn from each other, learn from experience, and build on that so that, when you do have a zoning request variance for use that doesn't make sense in your neighborhood and doesn't achieve walkability or doesn't, does pollute or that kind of thing, that the process and how to organize to do that, right? Because the power is with the people. We have stripped that away in many cases, and we've also, I think, forgotten. And so the ability to reclaim that sort of at all levels and to ensure that our decision makers know that we are reclaiming that is key. So thanks for the question. So to summarize and transition, bottom line, place matters, and how we build those places matters. The choices we make, whether related to our health, or, again, our day-to-day work, our overall well-being, those choices are driven by the choices that we have. And if we think about walking to school, the vast majority of school children in Indianapolis do not have a legitimate option, a safe, convenient, accessible option for walking to school. And as a result, we make decisions that influence our life and influence the lives of those around us and perpetuate the status quo. Again, bottom line, transportation options are what we need. We know they're good for people. We know they're good for the environment. We know there are all of these benefits to that. And yet we've spent many, many years, decades, building our communities for this, thinking of this as economic development, thinking of this as the way that people travel, and it's just simply not true. And so we, again, have to shape that conversation differently and expect policy and funding, budgeting to address that. So I am going to transition to talking about a lot of the work we're doing around walkability. We have branded this work as Walkways, coming out of a project that was funded through the American Planning Association, a few years ago, but with the original funding coming from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Brad was instrumental in that project on behalf of the city of Indianapolis, and the Marion County Public Health Department was a core partner in that as well. And so that work was all about ensuring or taking steps to ensure that Indianapolis is more walkable and to get more people walking, right? We want it to be safer, we want it to be more accessible, and we want walking to be inviting. So let's spend a few minutes talking, first, just tell me, like, why is walking important? What are some of those benefits? We've touched on a few already, but yeah, health. Walking is good for our health. Free? It's free. Great point. Just shout them out. It's good for the environment? Yep. Mobility. Yeah, being able to get around. Community. A sense of community, right? We interact with each other on the sidewalk in a way that we certainly don't when we're in cars. Say again?
I said it's usually angry when we're in cars.
That's right. It's usually angry in cars. I said in presentations for a long time, like, you don't really hear about bike rage, right? Between bicyclists, right? Road rage. Unfortunately, I've had so many bikers that have been, had rough interactions with cars that it's like, yeah, it's not the bike to bike issue. So anyway, I don't say that as much, but your point is exactly right. Any other just quick benefits that you want to think about? Eyes on the street, right. So the more people that are out seeing what's happening, paying attention, less crime is less likely, and there's less opportunity for it. I missed one back here. Good for business, that's right. So one of the other things that we often say is that the slower a wallet, in terms of businesses, the slower a wallet moves past the door, the more likely it is to open. Right? When you're driving by a strip mall at 40 miles per hour, you don't know what's in that strip. I mean, if you don't already know what's in the strip mall and where you're going, you're not popping in, right? But how many times, maybe on vacation, maybe in a Mass Ave, Fountain Square, whatever, you're like walking along and it's like, oh, look at that. Let me pop in and see that. And we know that so much research has been done over the years that people on foot, people biking, spend just as much money as people, and oftentimes under different circumstances, more than people driving. So let's talk then, shift to what makes a place walkable. What are the things that when you think of good walkability, whether it's where you live already, again, a place you've vacationed, or another part of town that maybe you like, what features make for good walkability?
Good sidewalks.
Good sidewalks.
Curbs.
Yes. Curbs. Right. Separation from the roadway. Street? Trees. Absolutely. Trees are so important. They don't get it. Safe crosswalks. Safety. Feeling safe on that. And that, just let me say one thing, I don't want to miss any of this. Safety, we often talk about in terms of the traffic safety, right? Like, are you physically safe from getting hit by a car? But then there's also the personal safety aspect, oftentimes, which is a perception, can vary widely among people, but what are the characteristics that make a place feel safe on a personal level for walking? So there were a couple back here, I think.
Somebody said crosswalks over here.
Crosswalks, absolutely. Street lights, very nice, thank you.
Destinations.
Having places to go, destinations, for sure.
Places to go that are close.
Places to go that are close. Right.
Recreational.
Recreational, having the opportunity to walk for exercise, for fun, for pleasure, to chat with people as you walk. Any others?
I would say, just because mobility-wise, some benches along the way.
Benches, exactly. Benches, some trees were mentioned, but the shade that comes with that, flowers, things that we think of like beautification, like, such an afterthought, right? But that makes for a really nice walk when it's pretty. So we have adapted these 5 elements from work that Jeff Speck, who's the leading author, speaker, planner, I think, around walkable communities, has said, which is that, we want to make places for people, not for cars, right? We need pedestrian scale. We need activities or things that people want to do, not separated by, long, wide parking lots. We want to have destinations and a sense of place, which again can come from benches and trees and that kind of thing, but the elements that, again, create that sort of, I think, the opportunity in sort of village centers or your own neighborhood to have, when you do have kind of a commercial node or a node of some sort that becomes yours, right? That's the identity of your part of the city or your neighborhood, and that destination, that sense of place is really, really key. The connections to nature, to greenery, we know how good that is for our mental health. It's extremely important. And so having that, the authenticity of a place, so, you know, walkability is good under any circumstances, I would argue, but some places feel more sort of man-made walkable as opposed to sort of naturally walkable, right? And I think that has to do with when it was built and sort of the features of that and that kind of thing. Having authenticity, again, reflecting the character and the context of the location is really important. And then again, encouraging diversity and variety in all its ways, not just of people, but of businesses, of the type of greenery and street furniture and that kind of thing. And so just as we go through this work and as you think about what you're doing in your community moving forward, I think keeping that idea of what a walkable community is, what those features are front and center, even when a lot of us don't have that in our day-to-day world, can be really important. One of the things I heard someone say years ago, which was really powerful, is that most of us choose to vacation in places that are really walkable, right? We go there because it's walkable, arguably even Disney Main Street, right? But then we don't expect that same thing where we live, or we do expect it, but we don't get it. And so just, again, sort of thinking about how we build that into our day-to-day, into the real world. So how many minutes on time? About 20. Okay, good. So this is a state of walkability report, which was developed as a component of the city's first pedestrian plan, which was adopted back in the spring of 2016 through that grant that I spoke of through the American Planning Association. I referenced it in terms of the state of walkability to just kind of tell you that part of the document gives a lot of really important information in terms of where we were at that point, in terms of the infrastructure in the city, what was available, what we understood the need to be, which is $1 billion and more, arguably, and sort of a reality check of where we were at. So it's good reference information. Certainly some of it has changed over the last 3+ years, but that's useful. The other thing that it's important for, as is the final plan itself, is that it talks about best practices. It talks about the types of things we can should expect on a policy level, from a procedural level, sort of internal decision-making systems, funding, and then programmatic types of things of like what are the things that encourage walkability and help to do that. And the final plan has 40 recommendations, again, many of which are referenced in the pre-document, but implementing those is not a quick, easy thing, right? Most of them are ongoing. A few of them haven't even been started. There might be one or two that we can comfortably put a check by. But I say that really to say, there isn't mystery around this stuff. We know what to do. We know what the research tells us. We know what the best practices are. We know what's working other places. We have to have the political will and commit the resources to doing it. One of the important things of the plan, again, just getting to process and sort of how we think about that, is when the demand is that great, we can't do everything that's needed, right? And so what the pedestrian plan put in place, which has been used in plans since, and I'm really proud of in terms of how important it is helping us think about prioritization, right? How do we decide when we have limited resources where to put them? And there are lots of ways of approaching that. I'll show an image, but we got public input in various ways. But ultimately what we decided was that things like health and safety and equity were most important, that they were weighted in terms of when we thought about all of these different factors which are represented by the maps, things like lighting and street width and speed and demand, what we would call generators, places where people want to walk or will walk from. But again, those health, safety, and equity factors are really important. And so the process allowed us to go through, it's actually a 2-phase prioritization to help think about that. Here's some imagery from the public involvement and different ways of collecting that. What does comfort mean? So it's that, again, I would say it's a subjective sense of feeling good walking. But for this, we accounted for things like lighting, for the speed of traffic on the adjacent roadway, for the number of lanes of traffic, that kind of thing. So the sort of comfort a person might feel on, how do you feel walking on 38th Street versus how do you feel walking on Mass Ave? And then ultimately, we did end up with a prioritized map, 3 tiers. You can see there's 3 shades of blue. I'm less interested in the specifics of the geography today than just letting you know that there are many, many areas of the city that, again, have significant walkability needs, don't necessarily have a walkable environment, and that we, again, are trying to work with the city and through the work we're doing and others to prioritize the investment of resources and the process for getting that in place. The other things that come into play in that is that walkability should improve transit access, right? It should get people to another mode, that it improves access to nearby destinations, exactly what we've said, that it enables active living, it helps us move and get around and be active, that the land use matters, right? Whether it's housing or factory or store or library, that all of that comes into play. Looking at pedestrian barriers, or the ability to fill those, so the highway, of course, a river, other major roadways that, again, serve as a barrier for people moving about on foot. And we also looked at things like leveraging funding and how that could happen, and then favorable considerations. And one of the factors in favorable considerations is sort of the presence of organized interest, if you will. So having a strong neighborhood group, having kind of a community of maybe a business development district that is clearly invested in that as well. And so then I think I may have said, but there are nearly 40 programs, policies, and procedures referenced. And so if you're interested in digging into what does it take to get a more walkable community, I encourage you to look at that. I'm always happy to have a conversation. Again, most of them are pretty big policy systems types of issues, but thinking about safe routes between the senior center and the library is a really important piece. Just want to talk then a little bit about some crash analysis work that we're doing. We have been we'll be going into our 10th year of data analysis in terms of where pedestrian crashes happen in the city. So you can see here the red dots are essentially a representation of where they happen. Countywide, pretty widely dispersed. It might be a little bit tough to see, but there are some shaded areas, mostly along 38th Street, the Meridian, Illinois, Capitol North and South Street corridor, 10th Street, Washington Street, and down toward Garfield Park, downtown, IUPUI, that kind of thing, that those are all what we call high crash zones based on the density of crashes. So what we know in those zones is that they account for 45% of all crashes across the county over that, this is an 8-year period that you're seeing here, but only represents 7% of the land area, right? So as we dig into the data, where we prioritize investments, this understanding of the factors at play, why crashes happen, the characteristics of those crashes is important. And I'm not going to take a lot of time going into that further. I want to kind of get to what we do about it, but I'm happy to share the information in various ways. And we have been and are continuing to work with neighborhood groups and others in priority areas and beyond to really change these rates.
Tell us.
Yeah.
What's the correlation? Is it traffic speed, the crime rate, demographics, and crime, and speed all together? Or?
Yeah, great question. So what are the commonalities? Kind of what are the factors that are leading to this? So these are, what was the word you had all learned earlier, the street type? Think of that, 38th Street. They are arterials, right? They are high-speed arterials. Cars are, maybe the speed limit's posted at 35, but cars are typically going 40, 45, 50. They're long and straight. There's really wide distances between intersections and safe places to cross. They are typically, these are underinvested communities. They're typically have more poverty, more people of color, less education, more need for transportation options, and are bearing the brunt of that. That's not different than data from across the country, and it's the case, again, because of decades of decision making. But the approaches matter because those are, the people matter, right? And there's different ways of addressing it, and yet also ways that we have to be really careful that when we think about what might create gentrification, or we think about police enforcement, like we're not just, go in and enforce speed limits in some of these areas because we know that there could be fatal outcomes for people of color under certain circumstances, right? So there's just a lot of tensions in that, and yet here we see it, the disproportionate impact, and it gives us the opportunity to do something about it. So these are individual zone maps, we call them. It just allows us to drill in and sort of look specifically at what intersection, was there a bus stop right there, that kind of thing. Just to give you a couple of quick stats related to that. So again, this is an 8-year period, 2,100 plus pedestrians, and also know that those are not all of the crashes. So we actually take some out for the analysis that we do. We estimate that a person is hit by a car every day in Marion County. They don't all get reported. In fact, we think more than a third don't get reported. I guess the good news is that only 7% are fatal, but that's still an incredibly huge number and is typically around 30 people a year, right, losing their lives because they've been hit by a car. 6 incapacitating injuries, so that 16%, it essentially means people don't walk away. They have to go in an ambulance or they have significant medical needs. Look at the next one. 20% of those crashes are hit and runs. That is, I don't know how to explain it. I'm not even sure how we're addressing it, but that is incredible. 60% about men, and more than 25% are children and youth under the age of 20. And then the last one is just to say, most are occurring in clear or dry daylight conditions. That is because that's when most people are out walking, right? That's generally it. So it's what we would call an exposure factor. But it is important to note that in the sense of we often think oh, well, we need streetlights, or oh, the person was wearing black clothes or whatever, right? People are getting hit under lots of circumstances that have nothing to do with their own, what they're wearing, or even sort of what the dark, cloudy, rainy conditions, right? And so I point that out just to say we have to do this work regardless of sort of when it happens. I'm going to skip over that slide right before, point out this equity slide. I'm just going to draw your attention to the 5th line from the top, or the second from the bottom, which is showing again the disproportionality of this. This is national data. So for non-whites, which includes Hispanics, the percentage of the population is about 35%. Pedestrian deaths, though, among that population are at 46%. So again, we know that people of color are disproportionately impacted. This is national data, but again, like I said, our local data bears that out. Just going through a few slides quickly, so we have a couple of minutes for questions. So extremely important about how we think about this. A crash is not an accident, right? We've gotten into sort of a way of talking about this, oh, well, it happened, there's nothing we can do about it, whatever. We absolutely know what to do about it. These are crashes, these are incidents, and we have to address them. And that is with media, that's with our neighbors, that's with our partners, that kind of thing. Speed is critically important. We often hear people say well, they just came out of nowhere, they jumped into the street, that kind of thing. This image is showing you your cone of vision when you're driving 15 miles per hour versus when you're driving 30 miles per hour. The faster you go, the narrower that field is. And so you're not going to see someone who you would have seen if you were going 10 miles per hour slower. And so speed is a critical matter, and how we design our streets influences speed more than anything else. It's not enforcement, it's not the signage, it's how the roadway is designed. Same thing here, just reinforcing that. If you're hit by a car going 20 miles per hour, you have a 90% chance of survival. If that car is going 40 miles per hour, your survivability decreases to 10%. So again, slowing down cars in places where we have a lot of people is what we have to do. So to go into, for a few minutes here, the things that we are doing. Walk audits are extremely important. Have any of you participated in a walk audit? Okay, good, a handful of you. So that's something we'd be happy to work with your neighborhood on. It's essentially going out, we have a number of different tools, but a checklist of like, are there sidewalks? Check. Is the pedestrian signal working? No. Is there a buffer between the sidewalk and the street? Things like that, and it gives you a way of looking at your community objectively, but with eyes that you might not always look at it, and then having the ability to then share those results with decision makers to say, as I recently heard about, I think 38th Street, like literally not one intersection had had all 4 pedestrian signals, or I'm sorry, it would be 8 actually pedestrian signals working, not one. So again, turning that data then into action, what we're doing. So we've done a series of pedestrian safety workshops. Again, something that's ongoing, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about. The intent is to provide education, have interaction among participants. We do a walk audit as part of that, and then we look at action planning. And through some evaluation, we know that people are gaining knowledge and sort of empowerment in terms of how they can address those things. We have had a few community champions, we call, who are local residents who have worked with us directly to reach out to businesses, neighborhood groups, others to help talk about walkability, think through some of these things, how we can address them. We continue to develop tools and reports, something called a Pedestrian Safety Action Plan that the city is using and will be using to address some of these specific areas. We've got an educational campaign that has materials and ways of providing sort of information about this, and I think there's some in the back still, right? And then we're also always looking again at that sort of policy systems thing. So with engineering, how can we work with the city's operations and maintenance to ensure that crosswalks are getting painted routinely, that we are repairing those pedestrian signals I referenced, that we're spending dollars, HSIP is a federal funding source, that we are bringing in dollars that specifically help us address walking and biking, that we're trying to have policies change, right? The downtown speed limit was reduced last winter, and that reduction has the ability to save lives for exactly the reasons we talked about. We are trying to get a no turn on red policy because we know that's a factor in a number of crashes. We haven't gotten that in place yet. You may hear more about that. And again, using technology to the extent we can to make places safer and to ensure that we're making our communities walkable. Here's a couple images from the Walkways campaign, and just again making the point to drivers, to others, to all of us to remember, this is we have a responsibility when we're driving and to others in our transportation system. So you can always use us as a resource. My information will be available. You'll get the slides. Happy to talk. When you have specific issues, I always encourage you to make 3 calls to your city county councilor, to your mayor's neighborhood advocate, and to the Mayor's Action Center. That Mayor's Action Center request Indy doesn't always feel like it works, but we're doing work with the city and helping to ensure that those things are captured. And the last thing I'll say is just that this work requires intention. We've been doing things the way we've been doing them for so long that it's just rote, right? It just happens. People's jobs they do what they've been doing for years and years. And so people like you, the work we're doing, the work that numerous partners are doing is there as a disruptor to help sort of push that like pause button, stop button to say, wait, what do we need to do differently in order to get a different outcome? So I just encourage you to think about that intentionality, how you can use that in the work that you're doing, and again, thank you for being here. Any time for questions or no? Okay. You said yeah, right? Or no?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much, Kim. So I want to open it up for questions for everybody. So this is open if you want to have questions about the activity that we did before, just lingering questions in general. Shoot them.
So, like, obviously, a lot of us probably buy into, the vision of walkable neighborhoods. But if people don't, one of the ways to get them to buy in is through the money aspect, right? Like, this is where your tax dollars are going. Do you guys have data on, like, how expensive it is to maintain bike lanes versus roadways? And what does that look like?
I don't, off the top of my head, have maintenance numbers. A bike lane done right is $250,000 a mile. A greenway is $1 million a mile. Sidewalks, I believe, $120 a linear foot for both sides. So the stuff isn't cheap, and Kim mentioned we spend several $1 million a year is all that we spend dedicated to pedestrian stuff. And so we don't have sidewalks where we need them because we're not allocating enough money. I mean, that's it.
One of the things India Rezone did was to stipulate that as part of a development, that the developer is responsible for putting, for example, bike parking in or sidewalks, right?
Yes, and so our new zoning code, and this was actually predates our new zoning code, but our more recent zoning regulations have required all development, residential, commercial, to put in sidewalks when it develops. And so that's when you see a new CVS or something going in at an intersection and they put in sidewalks that connect to nothing. That's because that's a new requirement that the previous development didn't have to have. And so it's kind of an incremental development.
Couple questions. One, Kim, are we able to get, are you gonna send this link to us so we can go through? Okay, so.
We'll
so
share the
that'll-
slides and my contact info is on that.
So that'll, once we get this, that'll give me the slides I need.
Sure.
And then the second thing is, so sidewalks, are you thinking about a new code that says sidewalks and bike lanes, or is that just too much to ask?
So sidewalks and bike lanes. Multiple. So if you remember from last time, I talked about Indy Moves. Indy Moves is our comprehensive transportation plan that includes, embeds the pedestrian plan, embeds the Greenways Master Plan, updates the bicycle plan, and ties all that together. And so we do have plans for hardcore bicycle facilities. We have plans for neighborways, which are quiet, protected streets that keep traffic calm and quiet, so you can ride your bike on the street, you can walk in the street. We have all of that. Now, is a bicycle lane necessary on every single street? No. There are, as long as you have the network and you can access the network, it doesn't necessarily need to be on every single street. And so, I guess that's.
Like, what are the plans calling for and when development is?
Yeah, and so like our plans, when we do have a development, especially when we have new subdivisions or development parks of our county, when it shows that we have a greenway trail planned or we have a bicycle facility planned, that stuff also gets put in by the developer typically.
Question for Kim. I was just mentioning to our host, I see an article today about an increase, nationwide increase in
Yes.
pedestrian crashes.
Yep.
Which I didn't read, of course. I just glanced at
That's all right.
the headline.
I think Tom brought a copy, so.
Good. No, thank you. Not having done my homework, let me ask you. So, and many of us would imagine that driving skills are generally going downward, especially if we also drive and we see that. But is it the case that pedestrian skills are also going downward, and is that a factor in this phenomenon?
Okay, so I've not actually read it either.
Yeah.
Let me tell you that. And I will be very curious because this is a governmental publication, which is great. We need it. They're the main collector of the data.
And I really wanted to ask in your experience and knowledge of the situation.
Yep. So here's what I will say. A distracted walker, under the rarest of circumstances, will hurt anybody. right? Potentially themselves, which is something, right? We don't want to put ourselves at risk. A distracted walker is no harm to the public, right?
It's happened to me, but go ahead.
Rare circumstances. You're so special. So the distracted driving is absolutely an issue. More than that, what I'm hearing a lot of is that we have seen a significant increase in SUVs and very large motor vehicles, right? The grill is going to be sort of at my head as opposed to at my knee under a lot of vehicles on the roadway. And that is one of the things that's being indicated as perpetuating. So what the article says overall is that traffic fatalities generally are decreasing for motor vehicles. They are increasing for people walking and biking. And it's a problem, and it's a problem that doesn't get talked about enough. And again, what I'll just offer is, it's not a direct answer, but it's really easy to get distracted by sort of, again, people wearing dark clothing or people on their phones when they're crossing their crosswalk or that kind of thing. Bottom line is that our street design matters more than anything. Street design influences speed, street design influences conflict points, separation. And from our perspective, while education matters, right? Knowing how to walk safely, knowing how to bike safely matters. If we allow the conversation to be distracted from focus on the built environment, focus on how the streets are designed, maintained, managed, we cannot come out ahead. We will continue to lose people who are walking and biking. One back there.
This question
Yeah.
is for you, Jan. I want to know if you have any information on the tax code, the tax rate, and how you talked about Center Township and its depression and the interstates coming through and the crime. If you have information about how long Center Township bore the highest tax rate versus, say, Broad Ripple.
Yeah.
Broad Ripple in the late 90s, early 2000s, or sometime in the 2000s, their tax rate changed, and you see, then they started paying, a pretty sizable amount of property taxes, whereby before their tax rate, they were paying $200. I was a realtor, so
Sure, you understand this. I actually don't know, so I'm not going to be able to speak to that. I know that revenue and expense or spending is often disproportionate, right?
You talk about the services that are provided, from those tax dollars and where they go.
Right.
Just looking at all the information, what you share with us about the community,
I just heard it anecdotally, and I don't have a good answer for that. I will repeat what I said, which I'm saying increasingly, is that this is about politics more than most anything. And it's hard to say that. For me, it's hard to, but we know what to do. We don't necessarily have the money to do it, but that is also a result of political decisions and political will. And I don't say that in criticism of any one person or a party or anything like that. We have really hard conversations to have as a city, as do most cities across the country, right? But we haven't been willing to have those conversations, and we haven't talked about them in the context of how it impacts certain neighborhoods compared to others. Here.
This is more biking than walking. I was just curious, how has the redesign of Pennsylvania Street with the bike lane inside the parking lane, how has that worked out? Is that something that's been successful, or?
So a couple things, and I actually live on Pennsylvania, so I see that. So a couple of things. We know that protected bike lanes, which is what that is, when the parking is on the outside, so the traffic's moving, the parking, and then the bikeway, that is very safe for cyclists. That is a safe move. One of the issues is that we have not consistently had bollards there marking that, and so people often park in the bike lane. Utilities, city vehicles, others often park in the bike lane. So number one, that. Number two, because we don't, until just recently with Illinois Street, we haven't had good sort of a northbound option. Lots of people use that, what was intended to be a southbound only bikeway, for northbound traffic only, which on a one-way street, again, brings some new conflict points and that kind of thing. So I think the design and the intent, and given that that was one of the earlier bike lanes in the city, theoretically very good. There's some practical reasons why it's been harder, but separation with bike lanes or with bikeways is key. Even if it's a bollard, even if it's a little bit of paint, certainly when we have, barriers.
All right, so I want to, earlier when we were talking about air pollution, I made the statement that we didn't strategically locate factories. I want to clarify that. Originally we did, originally we did not, right? The factories were on the river because they needed the river for waste disposal or water supply or whatever. And so that's, when the city started, that's where the factories went, the air pollution went east, the people with wealth could avoid the hazard and move to the north. Now, after that, we very intentionally, strategically located factories where? So we, across the nation, we strategically located them in lower income neighborhoods of color. Now, why did that happen? Was the factory owner inherently racist? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know that, so we're going to say no. So why did factories disproportionately end up in low income neighborhoods of color? Cheap land. Nobody was fighting them, so no resistance. Why was the land cheap?
Because they were communities of color.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they were communities of color, but why are communities of color and low property values associated?
Redlining?
Redlining,
Yeah,
right.
okay.
So the system, made the property affordable, made the property cheap. And we also, the system, dispowered people, right? So we disinvested and we dispowered people. And so that is why a lot of factories ended up across the nation, still happens today in neighborhoods of color. And so just want to clarify that because that's an important point. Hate the game, don't hate the player, right? And so the fact that that happened, don't blame the factory, don't blame any specific person.
Now they go to cornfields.
So now they go to cornfields, but the point is, hate the game, fight the game, change the rules. This goes back to Kim's, image of taking down the fence, right? And so I just want to clarify, that's an important point I wanted to clarify before we leave for today. So, any final comments or questions? All right, so we're taking a break next week. It's Halloween, and so we're not going to have you in. But then we will be back 2 weeks from now. I will not be in town, and so you'll have Brooke Thomas from Indigo, who will actually be talking about transit-oriented development, along with Brittany and Andrea here. And so I'll see you again in a few weeks. Thanks for coming out.